Hi everyone, I'm back for the second part of Chapter 2 of Socks. And if you remember yesterday when we left off reading, Mr. and Mrs. Bricker had just come home, and Mr. Bricker was holding something in his arms, and Socks was very curious and also very unsure as to what this was. So we're going to continue reading and see what it is and how Socks feels about it. As Socks stared at the strange creature in the bundle and listened to it smack and snuffle, he began to understand. His owners, his faithful, loving owners, had brought home a new pet to threaten his position in the household. Socks turned his back and lashed his swollen tail. He was filled with jealousy and anger and a terrible anxiety. The Brickers might love the new pet more than they loved him. Poor Socks, Mrs. Bricker stooped to soothe his fur, but Socks moved away from her. An unhappy wail came from the bundle. "Oh dear, he can't already be hungry." The worry in Mrs. Bricker's voice was a new sound to Socks. "He sure can," said Mr. Bricker as he sat down on the couch with the wailing bundle on the lap that had always belonged to Socks. "Listen to him. You can tell he has a fine pair of lungs." Socks turned his back and began washing to pass the time until he made up his mind how to regain the lap from the new pet. On her way to the kitchen, Mrs. Bricker spoke in a special voice, higher than her normal voice, that she had always used for her cat. "I'm hurrying," she said. "I'll have your bottle in a minute." Socks paused in his washing with one paw behind his ear until he understood that this time she was not speaking to him, a slight that hurt him almost as much as the loss of the lap. He scrubbed his paw back and forth across his nose until he couldn't contain his longing for reassurance any longer. Alert and ready to run at the first sign of danger, Socks crept cautiously towards Mr. Bricker, who reached for the bottle his wife had brought from the kitchen and said, "Let me feed him. You sit down and rest." Mrs. Bricker sat down, but she did not rest. "Are you sure you know how to feed him?" Both parents spoke of the baby as he, as if he were a stranger whose name they had not caught. "Nothing to it," Mr. Bricker offered the bottle to his son. Greedy smacks came from the bundle. "Hey, look at him go," said the proud new father. Socks took a chance. He leaped to the center of the couch, cautiously set one paw on Mr. Bricker's knee, leaned forward, and sniffed the sweet, milky fragrance. "Careful, Socks," warned Mr. Bricker. "You can look, but you can't come too close." Socks stared at the tiny wrinkled face with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and jealousy. He saw the baby open his eyes and raise one nightgown-covered fist, as if he did not know it belonged to him. He saw the baby's head wobble and his eyes cross. Socks began to understand that the creature was not a pet, but a new kind of person, a person so small that he left room on the lap for a cat. Very well, they could share the lap, but this concession did not mean he liked the new person. Socks felt that half a lap was better than none. Socks put a second paw on Mr. Bricker's knee, and with his eyes half closed, he began to knead and purr. "Ouch!" Both of Mr. Bricker's hands were occupied. "Take your claws out of my leg." Socks found himself lifted by Mrs. Bricker and set on the floor without so much as a kind word. He resumed his washing to show his owners that he had business of his own to take care of. Let them attend to theirs. He would attend to his. He groomed his tail with long, hard rasps of his pink tongue. The baby's smacking changed to fussing, another sound new to Socks. He hoisted his hind leg and went to work on his toes while he observed all that was going on. Beyond his hoisted leg, he could see Mrs. Bricker leaning anxiously over the baby. "Maybe he needs to be burped," she said. Mr. Bricker held up the bottle. "You're right. He's taken 2 ounces. He set the bottle on the table at the end of the couch, raised the baby to his shoulders, and began to pat its back. Still, the baby fussed. Mr. Bricker patted harder. Socks lowered his legs. There was plenty of room on the lap. No, better not risk reclaiming it so soon. He went on with his grooming, but he began to grow uneasy. He wanted the fretting to stop, the same way he always wanted the ringing of the telephone or the buzzing of the doorbell to be silenced. "Try rubbing instead of patting," suggested the anxious mother. The father rubbed. The fussing became a wail. Mr. Bricker rubbed the tiny back, and Mrs. Bricker patted. Socks became so anxious to have the crying stop that he no longer could pay attention to his washing. "Maybe we don't pat the right way," said the mother. "How else can you pat?" The father was beginning to see that there was more to feeding a baby than he had realized. Socks took a chance and leaped up to fill the lap, which was going to waste. Mrs. Bricker promptly returned him to the floor. Socks was deeply hurt. Filled with sorrow and longing, he lay down on the carpet with his chin on his white forepaw and stared into the black and empty fireplace. He yearned to be held and stroked and reassured. He longed to have his master hold him and play with his tail, and Socks was the most particular about allowing people to play with his tail. With a deep sigh, Socks closed his eyes, but he did not sleep. His ears, moving like tiny radar screens, picked up every sound. "What are we going to do?" Mrs. Bricker sounded most tearful. "If we don't get the air bubble up, his stomach's going to be hurting, and he's too little to hurt." "Feeding a baby can't be this hard," the father no longer sounded confident. "The world is full of dumbbells who feed babies. How else do babies survive?" "Try putting him face down, across your knees," suggested Mrs. Bricker. "I saw somebody do that once." The radar ears caught the soft sounds of the baby being moved, followed by gentle patting. "Try rubbing," suggested the hovering mother again. Suddenly, the baby belched. Startled, Socks raised his head and stared. The whole family was relieved. The baby, the mother, and the father, who were beaming at the miraculous thing their baby had done. Socks was relieved, too, because at least the crying had stopped. "Charles William," Mrs. Bricker spoke to her accomplished son by name. "Oh, such a big noise from such a little fellow." "Atta boy," Mr. Bricker congratulated his son. "That's the old fight." The atmosphere of the room had changed from one of anxiety to one of joy, which Socks felt was his to share. This time he stood at Mr. Bricker's feet and looked up uncertainly, as if to say, "I'm part of the family too." The Brickers were too busy to even notice. "Why, Charles William is asleep already," whispered Mrs. Bricker as she bent over her son. "Here, let me take him. I'll put him down in his crib." Now, thought Socks, now, with the new person out of the room, he could regain the lap. Before he could jump, however, Mr. Bricker picked up the bottle, which still had several ounces of baby formula, and started towards the kitchen. Socks got there first and sat down beside the refrigerator. "See how patiently I'm waiting beside the refrigerator with attitude," he seemed to say. Mr. Bricker unscrewed the top of the bottle. "Socks, it isn't time for you to eat," he said, and was about to dump the formula into the sink when Socks uttered such a wistful meow that he changed his mind. Mr. Bricker found a bowl, poured the formula into it, and carried it into the laundry room, where his feet crunched through the kitty litter that Socks had scattered. He set the bowl on the newspaper beside Socks's dish. Socks crouched and began to lap the sweet-smelling milk. Did you think we'd forgotten about you? Asked Mr. Bricker. Although Socks did not care to be interrupted while eating, this time he made an exception and gave his master a long stare that said, "How could you bring that new person into our house? Now you have spoiled everything." Sad and confused, Socks went back to lapping up the formula in his bowl. The warmth and sweetness of the milk comforted him. He lapped every drop and then licked the empty dish so hard he moved it across the newspaper until it bumped the wall. Socks needed every drop of consolation he could get. His owners loved the baby more than they loved him. And that's the end of the chapter. So chapter 3 coming up is called Socks and the Formula. So we'll have to see how Socks continues to feel, because right now he's not feeling very well, and I think he feels very overlooked because of the baby in the house. So keep up those awesome drawings, friends. Keep sending them my way, and I look forward to continuing chapter 3 with you tomorrow. All right, take care, everybody.